Today, I'm reading more stories from the Aesop for children. These are great stories to teach lessons on how we should behave. If you like my reading, won't you please subscribe and like this video? My next story is The Town Mouse and the Country Mouse. And it goes like this. A town mouse once visited a relative who lived in the country. For lunch, the country mouse served wheat stalks, roots, and acorns, with a dash of cold water for drink. The town mouse ate very sparingly, nibbling a little of this and a little of that, and by her manner making it very plain that she ate the simple food only to be polite. After the meal, the friends had a long talk, or rather the town mouse talked about her life in the city while the country mouse listened. They then went to bed in a cozy nest in the hedgerow and slept in quiet and comfort until morning. In her sleep, the country mouse dreamed she was a town mouse with all the luxuries and delights of city life that her friend had described for her. So the next day, when the town mouse asked the country mouse to go home with her to the city, she gladly said yes. When they reached the mansion in which the town mouse lived, they found on the table in the dining room the leavings of a very fine banquet. There were desserts and jellies, pastries, delicious cheeses, indeed, the most tempting foods that a mouse can imagine. But just as the country mouse was about to nibble a dainty bit of pastry, she heard a cat meow loudly and scratch at the door. In great fear, the two little mice scurried to a hiding place, where they lay quite still for a long time, hardly daring to breathe. When at last they ventured back to the feast, the door opened suddenly and in came the servants to clear the table, followed by the house dog. The country mouse stopped in the town mouse's den only long enough to pick up her carpet bag and umbrella. "You may have luxuries and dainties that I don't have," she said as she hurried away, "but I prefer my plain food and simple life in the country with the peace and security that go with it." And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, it's better to have little but feel safe than to have plenty while living in fear and uncertainty. My next story is The Fox and the Grapes, and it goes like this. A fox one day spied a beautiful bunch of ripe grapes hanging from a vine growing along the branches of a tree. The grapes seemed ready to burst with juice, and the fox's mouth watered as he gazed longingly at them. The bunch hung from a high branch, and the fox had to jump for it. The first time he jumped, he missed it by a long way. So he walked off a short distance and took a running leap at it, only to fall short once more. Again and again he tried, but in vain. Now he sat down and looked at the grapes in disgust. "What a fool I am," he said. "Here I am wearing myself out to get a bunch of sour grapes that are not worth looking at." And off he walked very, very scornfully. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, a lot of people act like they don't care about or criticize what they can't have. My next story is called The Bundle of Sticks. There was a certain father who had a family of sons who were always arguing among themselves. No words he could say did the least good, so he thought very hard to find a very striking example that should make them see that fighting would always lead to trouble. One day, when the quarreling had been much more violent than usual and each of the sons was moping in a surly manner, he asked one of them to bring him a bundle of sticks. Then, handing the bundle to each of his sons in turn, he told them to try to break it. But although each one tried his best, none was able to do so. The father then untied the bundle and gave the sticks to his sons to break one by one. This they did very easily. "My sons," said the father, "don't you see how certain it is that if you agree with each other and help each other, it will be impossible for your enemies to injure you? But if you are divided among yourselves, you will be no stronger than a single stick in that bundle." And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, strength comes from sticking together. My next story is called The Wolf and the Crane. A wolf had been feasting too greedily, and a bone had stuck crosswise in his throat. It wouldn't go up and it wouldn't go down, and of course he could not eat a thing. Naturally, that was an awful state of affairs for a greedy wolf. So away he hurried to the crane. He was sure that she, with her long neck and bill, would easily be able to reach the bone and pull it out. "I will reward you very handsomely," said the wolf, "if you pull that bone out for me." The crane, as you can imagine, was very uneasy about putting her head in a wolf's throat. But she was grasping in nature, so she did what the wolf asked her to do. When the wolf felt that the bone was gone, he started to walk away. "But what about my reward?" called the crane anxiously. "What?" snarled the wolf, whirling around. "Haven't you got it? Isn't it enough that I let you take your head out of my mouth without snapping it off?" And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, don't expect gratitude or rewards for helping bad people. My next story is called The Donkey and His Driver. A donkey was being driven along a road leading down the mountainside, when he suddenly took it into his silly head to choose his own path. He could see his stall at the foot of the mountain, and to him the quickest way down seemed to be over the edge of the nearest cliff. Just as he was about to leap over, the driver caught him by the tail and tried to pull him back, but the stubborn donkey would not yield and pulled with all his might. "Very well," said the driver, "go your way, you silly animal, and see where it leads you." With that he let go, and the foolish donkey tumbled head over heels down the mountainside. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, people who ignore good advice and insist on doing things their own way, despite wiser counsel, are setting themselves up for trouble. My next story is called The Bulls and the Wheels. A pair of bulls were drawing a heavily loaded wagon along a muddy country road. They had to use all their strength to pull the wagon, but they did not complain. The wheels of the wagon were of a different sort. Though the task they had to do was very light compared with that of the bulls, they creaked and groaned at every turn. The poor bulls, pulling with all their strength to draw the wagon through the deep mud, had their ears filled with the loud complaining of the wheels. And this, you may well know, made their work so much the harder to endure. "Silence," the bulls cried at last, out of patience. "What have you wheels to complain about so loudly? We're the ones doing all the work, not you, but you don't hear us complaining about it." And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, the ones who have it easiest are usually the ones who complain the most. My next story is called The Lion and the Mouse. A lion lay asleep in the forest, his great head resting on his paws. A timid little mouse came upon him unexpectedly, and in her fright and haste to get away, ran across the lion's nose. Roused from his nap, the lion laid his huge paw angrily on the tiny creature to kill her. "Spare me," begged the poor mouse. "Please let me go, and some day I will surely repay you." The lion was much amused to think that a mouse could ever help him. But he was generous and finally let the mouse go. Some days later, while stalking his prey in the forest, the lion was caught in the ropes of a hunter's net. Unable to free himself, he filled the forest with his angry roaring. The mouse knew the voice and quickly found the lion struggling in the net. Running to one of the great ropes that bound him, she gnawed it until it parted, and soon the lion was free. "You laughed when I said I would repay you," said the mouse. "Now you see that even a mouse can help a lion." And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, a kindness is never wasted. My next story is called The Shepherd Boy and the Wolf. A shepherd boy tended his master's sheep near a dark forest not far from the village. Soon he found life in the pasture very dull. All he could do to amuse himself was to talk to his dog or play on his shepherd's pipe. One day, as he sat watching the sheep and the quiet forest, and thinking what he would do should he see a wolf, he thought of a plan to amuse himself. His master had told him to call for help should a wolf attack the flock, and the villagers would drive it away. So now, though he had not seen anything that even looked like a wolf, he ran toward the village shouting at the top of his voice, "Wolf! Wolf!" As he expected, the villagers who heard the cry dropped their work and ran in great excitement to the pasture. But when they got there they found the boy doubled up with laughter at the trick he had played on them. A few days later the shepherd boy again shouted, "Wolf! Wolf!" Again the villagers ran to help him, only to be laughed at again. Then one evening as the sun was setting behind the forest and the shadows were creeping out over the pasture, a wolf really did jump from the underbrush and start attacking the sheep. In terror the boy ran toward the village shouting, "Wolf! Wolf!" But though the villagers heard the cry, they did not run to help him as they had before. "He won't fool us again," they said. The wolf killed a great many of the boy's sheep and then slipped away into the forest. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, people don't trust liars, even when they're telling the truth. My next story is called The Gnat and the Bull. A gnat flew over the meadow with much buzzing for so small a creature and settled on the tip of one of the horns of a bull. After he had rested a short time, he made ready to fly away. But before he left he begged the bull's pardon for having used his horn for a resting place. "You must be very glad to have me go now," he said. "It's all the same to me," replied the bull. "I did not even know you were there." And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, we often think we're more important than others see us. My next story is called The Sycamore Tree. Two travelers, walking in the noonday sun, sought the shade of a wide-spreading tree to rest. As they lay looking up among the pleasant leaves, they saw that it was a sycamore tree. "How useless is the sycamore," said one of them. "It bears no fruit whatever, and only serves to litter the ground with leaves." "Ungrateful creatures," said a voice from the sycamore tree. "You lie here in my cooling shade, and yet you say I am useless. That's how ungrateful people are when it comes to the blessings they receive." And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, our best blessings are often the least appreciated. My next story is called The Farmer and the Stork. A stork of a very simple and trusting nature had been asked by a bunch of fun-loving cranes to visit a field that had been newly planted. But their fun party ended dismally when all the birds got tangled in the farmer's net. The stork begged the farmer to spare him. "Please let me go," he pleaded. "I belong to the stork family who you know are honest and birds of good character. Besides, I did not know the cranes were going to steal anything." "You may be a very good bird," answered the farmer, "but I caught you with the thieving cranes and you will have to share the same punishment with them." And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, people will judge you based on the people you hang out with. My next story is called The Sheep and the Pig. One day a shepherd discovered a fat pig in the meadow where his sheep were pastured. He very quickly captured the piggy, which squealed at the top of its voice the moment the shepherd laid his hands on it. You would have thought, to hear the loud squealing, that the pig was being cruelly hurt. But in spite of its squeals and struggles to escape, the shepherd tucked his prize under his arm and started off to the butcher's in the marketplace. The sheep in the pasture were much astonished and amused at the pig's behavior, and followed the shepherd and his charge to the pasture gate. "What makes you squeal like that?" asked one of the sheep. "The shepherd often catches and carries off one of us. But we would feel very ashamed to make such a terrible fuss about it like you do." "That is all very well for you to say," replied the pig, with a squeal and a frantic kick. "When he catches you he is only after your wool. But he wants my bacon." And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, it's easy to act brave when there's no real threat. My next story is called The Travelers and the Bag of Money. Two men were traveling in company along the road when one of them picked up a well-filled bag of money. "How lucky I am," he said. I have found a bag of money. Judging by its weight, it must be full of gold. Do not say, I have found a bag of money, said his companion. Say rather, we have found a bag of money, and, how lucky we are. Travelers ought to share alike the fortunes or misfortunes of the road. No, no, replied the other angrily. I found it and I am going to keep it. Just then they heard a shout of, Stop, thief, and looking around, saw a mob of people armed with clubs coming down the road. The man who had found the bag of money fell into a panic. We are lost if they find the money on us, he cried. Oh, no, replied the other, you wouldn't say, we, before, so don't say it now. Say instead, I am lost. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, we can't expect others to share our struggles if we're not willing to share our successes too. My next story is called The Lion and the Donkey. One day as the lion walked proudly down a forest path, and the animals respectfully made way for him, a donkey brayed a scornful remark as he passed. The lion felt a flash of anger. But when he turned his head and saw who had spoken, he walked quietly on. He would not honor the fool with even so much as a stroke of his claws. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, don't let a fool's comments bother you. Just ignore them. My next story is called The Frogs Who Wished for a King. The frogs were tired of ruling themselves. They had so much freedom that it had spoiled them, and they did nothing but sit around croaking in a bored manner and wishing for a government that could entertain them with the pomp and display of royalty, and rule them in a way to make them know they were being ruled. No milk and water government for them, they declared. So they sent a petition to Jupiter asking for a king. Jupiter saw what simple and foolish creatures they were, but to keep them quiet and make them think they had a king, he threw down a huge log, which fell into the water with a great splash. The frogs hid themselves among the reeds and grasses, thinking the new king to be some fearful giant. But they soon discovered how tame and peaceable King Log was. In a short time the younger frogs were using him for a diving platform, while the older frogs made him a meeting place, where they complained loudly to Jupiter about the government. To teach the frogs a lesson, the ruler of the gods now sent a crane to be king of Frogland. The crane proved to be a very different sort of king from old King Log. He gobbled up the poor frogs right and left, and they soon saw what fools they had been. In mournful croaks they begged Jupiter to take away the cruel tyrant before they should all be destroyed. Hey now, cried Jupiter, aren't you content? You have what you asked for, and so you have only yourselves to blame for your misfortunes. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, make sure you can improve your situation before trying to change it. My next story is called The Owl and the Grasshopper. And it goes like this. The owl always sleeps during the day. Then after sundown, when the rosy light fades from the sky and the shadows rise slowly through the wood, out she comes ruffling and blinking from the old hollow tree. Now her weird hoo-hoo-hoo-oh-oh echoes through the quiet wood, and she begins her hunt for the bugs and beetles, frogs and mice she likes so well to eat. Now there was a certain old owl who had become very cross and hard to please as she grew older, especially if anything disturbed her daily naps. One warm summer afternoon, as she dozed away in her den in the old oak tree, a grasshopper nearby began a joyous but very raspy song. Out popped the old owl's head from the opening in the tree that served her both for door and for window. Get away from here, sir, she said to the grasshopper. Have you no manners? You should at least respect my age and let me sleep in peace. But the grasshopper answered saucily that he had as much right to his place in the sun as the owl had to her place in the old oak. Then he struck up a louder and still more noisy tune. The wise old owl knew quite well that it would do no good to argue with the grasshopper, nor with anybody else for that matter. Besides, her eyes were not sharp enough by day to permit her to punish the grasshopper as he deserved. So she stopped being critical and instead spoke very kindly to him. "Well, sir," she said, "if I must stay awake, I am going to settle right down to enjoy your singing. Now that I think of it, I have a wonderful wine here, sent to me from Olympus, of which I am told Apollo drinks before he sings to the high gods. Please come up and have some of this delicious drink with me. I know it will make you sing like the angels themselves." The foolish grasshopper was taken in by the owl's flattering words. Up he jumped to the owl's den, but as soon as he was near enough so the old owl could see him clearly, she pounced upon him and ate him up. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, don't mistake flattery for genuine admiration, stay sharp, even when someone's praising you. My next story is called The Wolf and His Shadow. A wolf left his cozy home one evening in fine spirits and an excellent appetite. As he ran, the setting sun cast his shadow far out on the ground, and it looked as if the wolf were 100 times bigger than he really was. "Why," exclaimed the wolf proudly, "see how big I am. Imagine me running away from a puny lion. I'll show him who is fit to be king, me or him." Just then a gigantic shadow blotted him out entirely, and the next instant a lion struck him down with a single blow. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, don't let your imagination make you lose sight of reality. My next story is called The Oak and the Reeds. A giant oak tree stood near a brook in which grew some slender reeds. When the wind blew, the great oak stood proudly upright with its 100 arms uplifted to the sky. But the reeds bowed low in the wind and sang a sad and mournful song. "You have reason to complain," said the oak. "The slightest breeze that ruffles the surface of the water makes you bow your heads, while I, the mighty oak, stand upright and firm before the howling tempest." "Do not worry about us," replied the reeds. "The winds do not harm us. We bow before them and so we do not break. You, in all your pride and strength, have so far resisted their blows. But the end is coming." As the reeds spoke, a great hurricane rushed out of the north. The oak stood proudly and fought against the storm, while the yielding reeds bowed low. The wind redoubled in fury, and all at once the great tree fell, torn up by the roots, and lay among the pitying reeds. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, it's wiser to let go when resisting is pointless than to hold on and face ruin. My next story is called The Rat and the Elephant. A rat was traveling along the king's highway. He was a very proud rat, considering his small size and the bad reputation all rats have. As Mr. Rat walked along, he kept mostly to the ditch. He noticed a great commotion up the road, and soon a grand procession came in view. It was the king and his retinue. The king rode on a huge elephant adorned with the most gorgeous trappings. With the king in his luxurious coach were the royal dog and cat. A great crowd of people followed the procession. They were so taken up with admiration of the elephant that the rat was not noticed. His pride was hurt. "What fools!" he cried. "Look at me, and you will soon forget that clumsy elephant. Is it his great size that makes your eyes pop out? Or is it his wrinkled hide? Why, I have eyes and ears and as many legs as he. I am just as important, and—" But just then the royal cat spied him, and the next instant, the rat found out that he was not quite so important as an elephant. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, just because we share some traits with great people doesn't make us great too. My next story is called The Boys and the Frogs. Some boys were playing one day at the edge of a pond in which lived a family of frogs. The boys were having fun by throwing rocks into the pond so as to make them skip on top of the water. So many rocks were flying so quickly and the boys were enjoying themselves a lot, but the poor frogs in the pond were trembling with fear. At last one of the frogs, the oldest and bravest, put his head out of the water and said, "Oh, please, dear children, stop throwing rocks at us. Though it may be fun for you, it means death to us." And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, before having fun, consider if it might hurt someone else. My next story is called The Crow and the Water Pitcher. In a spell of dry weather, when the birds could find very little to drink, a thirsty crow found a water pitcher with a little water in it. But the pitcher was high and had a narrow neck, and no matter how he tried, the crow could not reach the water. The poor thing felt as if he would die of thirst. Then an idea came to him. Picking up some small pebbles, he dropped them into the pitcher one by one. With each pebble the water rose a little higher until at last it was near enough so he could drink. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, when you're in a tough spot, thinking smart can save the day. My next story is called The Ants and the Grasshopper. One bright day in late autumn, a family of ants were rushing around, very busy in the warm sunshine, drying out the grain they had stored up during the summer, when a starving grasshopper, his fiddle under his arm, came up and humbly begged for a bite to eat. "What?" cried the ants in surprise, "haven't you stored anything away for the winter? What in the world were you doing all last summer?" "I didn't have time to store up any food," whined the grasshopper. "I was so busy making music that before I knew it the summer was gone." The ants shrugged their shoulders in disgust. "Making music, were you?" they cried. "Very well, now dance." And they turned their backs on the grasshopper and went on with their work. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, there's a time for work and a time for play. My next story is called A Raven and a Swan. And it goes like this. A raven, which you know is black as coal, was jealous of the swan, because her feathers were as white as the purest snow. The foolish raven got the idea that if he lived like the swan, swimming and diving all day long and eating the weeds and plants that grow in the water, his feathers would turn white like the swan's. So he left his home in the woods and fields and flew down to live on the lakes and in the marshes. But though he washed and washed all day long, almost drowning himself, his feathers remained as black as ever. And as the water weeds he ate did not agree with him, he got thinner and thinner, and at last he died. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, changing your habits won't change who you really are. My next story is called The Two Goats. And it goes like this. Two goats, frisking happily on the rocky steeps of a mountain valley, just happened to meet, one on each side of a deep ravine through which poured a really fast mountain stream. The trunk of a fallen tree formed the only means of crossing the ravine, and on this not even two squirrels could have passed each other in safety. The narrow path would have made the bravest tremble. Not so the two goats. Their pride would not permit either one to stand aside for the other. One set her foot on the log. The other did likewise. In the middle they met horn to horn. Neither would give way, and so they both fell, to be swept away by the rushing stream below. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, it is smarter to give in than to let stubbornness lead to trouble. My next story is called The Donkey and the Load of Salt. And it goes like this. A businessman, driving his donkey homeward from the seashore with a heavy load of salt, came to a river crossed by a shallow crossing. They had crossed this river many times before without accident, but this time the donkey slipped and fell when halfway over. And when the businessman at last got him to his feet, a lot of the salt had melted away. Because he was so happy to find how much lighter his burden had become, the donkey finished the journey very quickly. Next day the businessman went for another load of salt. On the way home the donkey, remembering what had happened the day before, purposely let himself fall into the water, and again got rid of most of his burden. The angry businessman immediately turned around and took the donkey back to the seashore, where he loaded him with 2 great baskets of sponges. At the crossing the donkey again tumbled over, but when he had scrambled to his feet, he was very discouraged and unhappy. His load of sponges had soaked up so much water that his load was now 10 times heavier than before. And the moral of this story, according to my grandma, is, what works in one situation might not work in another. Reading Aesop's fables gives us important lessons about life. The stories teach us things like being kind, telling the truth, and thinking before we act. When we remember the lessons from these stories, we can make better choices and understand things better. Aesop's fables show us how the right lessons can help us be better people. I enjoyed reading these stories and I hope you'll come back again. Thanks for visiting.